Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Farmington Community Library. My name is Rebecca, and I'm just absolutely overjoyed to see so many wonderful faces with us tonight, in person and also virtually through Zoom. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us this evening for our very special author event, An Evening with Wade Rouse, who most of you know as Viola Shipman. And I'd like to thank Farmington Friends of the Library's President Stacy, who we just heard from, and the Farmington Friends of the Library for generously sponsoring this program. Wade Rouse is the internationally best-selling author of multiple books, both fiction and nonfiction, which have been translated into nearly 20 languages. Wade's books have been selected as must-reads by NBC's Today Show, featured in the Washington Post, USA Today, on Chelsea Lately, and were chosen 3 times as Indie Next Picks by the nation's independent booksellers. Wade's grandmother was a working poor Ozark seamstress whose sacrifices and love changed his family's life. His heartfelt intergenerational novels are inspired by her memory and her heirlooms. He chose Viola Shipman as his pen name to honor her legacy, his elders and family, as well as to inspire hope and remind readers of what matters most in life. So you'll notice there are papers on your seat. We mentioned it earlier. I just want to say it again. They're for you to write down any questions that you might have for Wade. We will have a Q&A session. At the beginning of the Q&A session, if you still have your paper, just pass it over to the right so we can get them up here for us. And if you are watching virtually through Zoom and you have any questions, make sure you put those questions in the chat so we can get to them. For our grand finale, Wade will be signing books down in the main lobby. And our local bookstore, Road Less Traveled Books, is in the back. If you haven't been able to purchase anything yet, after the program, you will have some time to do that as well. And I just want to please remind everyone that when we do head downstairs, let's do it in an orderly fashion, please. And now it is my extreme honor and pleasure to welcome to Farmington Community Library and introduce to you tonight, Wade Rouse.
Thank you all very much for coming out on this beautiful Monday. We can keep this weather rolling through February. We'll be good, right? Thank you very much to the library, to the friends of the library, to the librarians who took me out before this and got me the largest glass of wine known to man. Very helpful. I do not typically give a normal author lecture. Instead, tonight, I'm going to take you through a journey of my life and how I know it's shocking, isn't it? And how I came to write the books that I do. I turned 59 years old this year, if you can believe it. You're supposed to be stunned. Thank you. So I'm going to take you back through my childhood in the Missouri Ozarks. I did not grow up in Michigan. I was born and raised in Missouri in the Ozarks. And that's where my love of writing and my love of my grandmother first took root. I take it you've all seen the TV show Ozark. They sugarcoated it. Way rougher for a boy like me who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, who, pardon my language, essentially emerged from his mother's womb dressed like this, who liked to write, read poetry, and was carrying a can of Aquanet, I'm sure. My mother and my grandmother, Viola Shipman, who I will talk a lot about tonight, protected me. And they loved me unconditionally. And they are the reason that I'm standing before you today, an unscarred human being that instead sees all my incredible blessings that have been given to me. They believed in me and they refused to let anything happen to me. They took me under their wings and their apron strings and taught me to dream. Growing up, my grandma was my best friend. We watched Lawrence Welk. For those of you back here, that was a show. Old man with an orchestra and a wand. That's where she taught me to dance. We watched all the Peanuts holiday cartoons together. I want to tell you a little bit about my grandma and grandpa Shipman. They were dirt poor. And when I mean dirt poor, I mean they didn't have a nickel or dime to rub together. My grandma Shipman never finished high school. She never learned to drive. She stitched overalls at a local factory her whole life until she couldn't stand straight. My grandfather was an ore miner. And when that work dried up, he raked rocks off of farmers' fields in the Ozarks so they could till the land. The story of my family goes like this. My grandparents kept an old crock in their garage. Do you remember old crocks? For those in the back, it was a giant urn about this tall. And whenever they had a spare nickel or a spare dime or a quarter, they'd throw it into that crock. And over many, many years, that crock got filled with change. And my grandpa got his friends to help him put it in the back of his pickup truck, and they hauled it to the local community bank. And they started a college fund for my mother. My mother became the first person in our family to graduate college. I like to say that change changed the course of my family's life. That's why I'm a writer. They sacrificed everything for my family. Everything. And over time, as we age, we lose that feeling of safety. I did. I did everything with my grandma and my grandpa growing up. My grandma volunteered, as we were talking about, at the local library. Even though she never finished high school, she pushed books into my hands from the earliest of ages. And she told me that education would change my life. One of my earliest and fondest memories is going to the library hand in hand with my grandmother. Our library was tiny and sat under our town's arching trees. The steps I remember were always a bit mossy in the spring, and walking inside to me was akin to entering heaven. It smelled like another world, a magical world, and a world filled with secrets that I needed to know. I spent hours in that library. I was always first in line for the school's bookmobile. If you don't know what that was, I can tell you later. I talked to all of the librarians about their favorite books, and it was there that I began to read Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and Where the Red Fern Grows and Call of the Wild. I read newspapers, I read magazines, and I began to read a writer named Irma Bombeck. Thank you. I'll explain her later too. I often, as you can imagine, didn't fit in at school, and the local library served as my refuge. It was where I was encouraged not only to think critically, but to be smart, to think beyond the small world in which I lived. Moreover, I was encouraged to dream, as I said, and I will tell you this, once that seed is planted, it takes root in a child's soul. There's nothing bigger or more special than a child's dream. Irma Bombeck once said, as a child, my number one best friend was the librarian in my grade school. I actually believed all those books belonged to her. And despite the stunning sea change in our library system today, as well as in publishing and the world, that core remains unchanged. Reading changes lives. Books change lives. Books save lives. I know because they saved mine. So I simply want to say at the beginning of this, what I'm sure too few people say to our libraries and librarians, or to all of those gathered here tonight, thank you from the bottom of my heart for supporting libraries. I spent every Saturday with my grandmother watching her get her hair did at the local beauty parlor. She favored those 70s perms. Do you remember those? Giant hair. My grandmother would sit under those hair dryers for about 7 hours. And when she would emerge, the woman would backcomb the hell out of her hair for about 7 hours until she sprayed it until it wouldn't move. On special occasions, my grandma would have glitter sprinkled into her hair, and it would shimmer like a planet. I think that's where my fascination with hair first started. If you don't know me, I have a thing about my hair. It's kind of stayed like this for the last 50 years. And yet when I walk out into the wind, I'm like, I have to be sheltered. So I blame my grandmother. But it was more than that. It was the stories that women shared with each other in the beauty parlor. I was privy to hear stories and secrets and tales that all of the men folk never heard. And I have to tell you, those stories changed me profoundly. Their secrets and their hopes and their dreams stayed with me and in my heart. And that started my journey of writing the books that I do to this day. Every single Sunday, I spent in church with my grandmother who taught Sunday school. During service, I would hold her hand, and I got to know every charm on her charm bracelet by touch. I grew up in my grandmother's gardens. She was a grand gardener who grew both flowers and vegetables. If you know a Depression era woman, they had to have veggies in their garden too because food might go away at one point. My grandmother grew my most favorite flower in the world, huge puffs of pink and white peonies that grew so large they exhausted their stems and flopped on the ground just like our old hounds did during the dog days of summer. My grandmother planted long rows of peonies outside of her tiny little house, and she ran her clothesline over them so that when she hung her sheets out to dry and then made the bed, they smelled like peonies. When she tucked me in and I'd pull the covers up and sniff the sheets, my grandmother would always say to me, "This is what heaven will smell like." We ate tomatoes, warm and juicy, straight off the vine from her garden, or we used to make tomato sandwiches. I'll tell you what that was too. It was sliced tomato on bread with mayonnaise and salt and pepper. Again, that was heaven. It still is. In fact, spending time in my grandmother's kitchen is one of the best memories of my childhood. Many school nights, nearly every Sunday after church, and every single holiday was spent in my grandma's tiny kitchen, which on any given day was about 800 degrees. And she taught me about my family by the food we made together. She'd pull recipe cards from her old recipe card that sat on her Formica counter, recipes written in cursive. I'll explain that too later. Recipes that were stained with butter and lard and vanilla. And she told me stories about people I'd never met through the food that we made together. My grandmother was a beautiful baker. She had a recipe box devoted entirely to desserts. Cookies, cupcakes, salads, as she called them, which meant Jell-O, with fruit and whipped topping, cakes and pies. I loved making cakes and pies the most with her, and I can still feel her hands on mine, teaching me how to crimp a crust. As a thank you for helping her in the kitchen, my grandmother would always take over the leftover pieces of dough. She would roll them out, sprinkle them with cinnamon and sugar, and preach into the choir, and bake it in the oven. And I would always eat it hot with a big glass of milk. My grandmother's cakes were works of art, especially my favorite, her cherry chip cake, which she made for me on every special occasion. Birthdays, holidays, straight eight report cards. I even made up excuses to get that cake. My grandmother would always make this cherry chip cake, pull up 2 chairs to her pink Formica table, cut 2 slices of cake, pour me a glass of milk and herself a cup of coffee, and she would ask me to tell her all about my dreams. Most afternoons after school, the bus would drop me off at my grandparents' tiny house since my parents both worked, and I would wait on her front porch until I'd see her walking home after work down Main Street. Again, she didn't drive. She walked straight down Main Street to the factory and walked straight home. She'd take me inside, give me an after-school snack, which was usually a Little Debbie from her bread box. I will also explain that later. I thought, by the way, for many years that Little Debbies were the foundation of the food pyramid. I love a Little Debbie still to this day. I would take my snack into her tiny little sewing room. I would do my homework. I would play with the buttons in my grandmother's button jars, and I would watch her sew. Even after a long day of sewing overalls, My grandma came home to sew on her Singer sewing machine because it was her passion and her love. She used to buy used blouses and coats, rip the buttons off of them, and I would help her pick the prettiest buttons, which she'd sew on to make them all new again. As I got older, I used to just sit on the floor and stare at my grandmother sewing, wondering how a woman could be so content for the end of her life, just sitting in a tiny little room, remaking clothes as her grandson watched. Every summer I spent with my grandparents at an old log cabin in the middle of nowhere. I grew up in the middle of nowhere. This cabin was in the middle of nowhere. I stayed with my grandparents when school left out on Memorial Day until Labor Day. There was no TV, there was no telephone, there was no microwave, and for many years we had an outhouse. We bathed right in the creek. We had nothing, and yet we had everything. We had books, inner tubes, fishing poles, and each other. That's the place I got to know my grandparents as real people. Not just my grandmother and my grandpa, but flesh and blood humans who dreamed and laughed and lost and loved just as I did. Probably the most seminal memory of my childhood was watching my grandmother and my mother read Irma Bombeck's column At Wit's End in our local rural newspaper. My grandma would save the paper until my mother could join her, and the two would pull up chairs at that pink Formica dining room table, pour 2 cups of coffee, and they would read the column together. I can still see their faces clear as day. After a long day or week of work, they would sit beside each other, faces drawn, exhausted, and slowly their cheeks would lift. Their brows would soften, their lips would curl, they would smile, and then finally they would double over in laughter. For one moment in this very tough world, my mom, a nurse, and my grandmother, a seamstress, would forget about their troubles, their aches, pains, losses, and they would simply laugh together. And then my grandmother would retrieve a pair of scissors from a kitchen drawer. She would cut out Irma's column, put it on her refrigerator under a magnet of a spotted bovine that read, "Holy cow, I can't believe I ate the whole thing." And that's the first time I can remember thinking, if I could do that, if I could just make my grandmother or mother laugh through something I wrote, wouldn't that be the most amazing job in the world? When my grandma would cut out Irma's column and place it on the fridge, I would take the old one and place it in a scrapbook. I collected them out of love for my grandmother at first and my mom, thinking they might want to reread them at one point in their lives. But the older I got, I began to reread those columns myself. I started to study Irma Bombeck's columns, and I found myself laughing. And that's when I first dreamed of being a writer. So I started just like Irma Bombeck did. And if you don't know Irma Bombeck, she was a woman raising a family, trying to make it as a humor writer in an all-male world where women were not allowed to be funny. And she would lock herself into the bathroom where she could have a little bit of quiet time. And she made it. She became one of the most recognized writers and humorists of our time. So I locked myself in my bedroom and I wrote stories in longhand about my family, essentially how crazy they were. All of the women in my life, my mom, my grandma, my great aunts, my cousins, were incredible oral storytellers. If you know the Ozarks, we could tell a good story. My mom and grandma and great aunts could tell tales that kept you riveted until the punchline. My mother, in fact, never met a period or comma in her entire life. She could tell stories, usually the same ones, over and over and over again that lasted for days. My father was a chemical engineer, and he would get so annoyed that he would storm out of the room and yell from another, "Land the plane, Geraldine." My family was funny and cantankerous, and pardon my language, just batshit. And I loved them very, very much. One Christmas, I opened a huge present and found that my grandma and grandpa Shipman had gotten me an aquamarine Selectric typewriter. I can explain those later too. My grandma told me this typewriter would help make all of my dreams come true. One of the very first things I ever wrote on that Selectric typewriter was a letter to Irma Bombeck. My grandma found an old address. I pinned a letter telling Irma how much my mom and grandma loved her writing and how I dreamed of being just like her. My family all warned me very gently that I might never hear from Irma Bombeck, but I knew better. I felt just like Ralphie in A Christmas Story. My dream was going to come true, and so I waited and I waited and I waited. And then one day, my dad brought home a giant padded envelope addressed to me. Inside was an autographed picture of Irma Bombeck, as well as a handwritten note on a card that said, "Keep writing, laughing, and believing, Wade." It turned out not only to be fortuitous advice, but also probably the best advice I ever got in my life. Because in middle school, I made the horrific mistake of singing Delta Dawn. The Tanya Tucker version, by the way. It's the best one. For our talent contest, while holding a faded rose. This was in front of a crowd that made the fellows from Deliverance look like the Jonas Brothers. I was heckled off stage, probably wearing this exact same outfit. And I ran off that rickety runway directly to my mother and my grandmother and yelled, "How could you let me humiliate myself like that?" And I remember my grandmother saying to me very calmly, "No one should ever stand in the way of you being you." As if they knew we were going to bomb, they had gifts waiting to ease my pain. They gave me a little leather writing journal and a copy of The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank by Irma Bombeck. And inside, my grandmother had inscribed, "Keep writing, laughing, and believing, Wade." Side note, I teach writing workshops, and I still teach from that copy of The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank. And whenever I'm on a fancy literary panel and writers discuss who their favorite authors are, I always say Irma Bombeck. And they all roll their eyes or act like they don't know who she is. And I'm always like, "You're all full of crap." Because they say Dostoevsky, and I'm like, he sucks. I say Irma Bombeck to high school students, college students, and I get crickets today. And then I read this line from The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank that Irma Bombeck wrote. She wrote, "I didn't know why my husband gasped every time Lassie cleared the fence until I was 26. Still funny. So fast forward a few years after my middle school Delta Dawn debacle, I lost my brother Todd when he was 17 and I was 13 in a tragic accident. My brother was everything I wasn't. He was a tough country boy who I believed would give my family everything they wanted and deserved. As you can imagine, this sent me and my family into a tailspin. My father refused to discuss his death. My mother refused to get out of bed. And I truly believed that God had made a horrible mistake. I thought it should have been me. It was my grandmother who willed us back to life, who said that by ignoring my brother's memory, we were ignoring his existence and the gifts he gave us and the life he had. My grandmother said to me, and I wrote this down in a notebook, to bury his memory along with his body is a disgrace. She told me to start writing about him, and I believe that saved me. I wanted to be a writer in college, but I went to college in the 80s. 80s was all Michael Douglas, Wall Street, get your MBA, make as much money as you can. And my friends and my father told me that being a writer was nonsensical and that I would never make a living, needed to get a real job, make real money. And for the first time in my life, fear crept in. And my mother and my grandmother kept believing in me and encouraging me to write. They were overjoyed when I was accepted to Northwestern University for graduate school, and my grandmother, who was very sick at the time, gathered every ounce of strength she had in her body and helped me move to Chicago, which was the biggest city she'd ever been in. When I went home that Christmas, which would be her final Christmas, she was even more sick, and yet she had managed to make my favorite dessert when I walked in, that cherry chip cake. She poured me a glass of milk, poured herself a cup of coffee, and pulled up 2 chairs to that same pink Formica table in front of the same refrigerator with the same cow magnet still on it. And she asked me to tell her all about Chicago and my dreams of being a writer. When I told my grandmother that I was scared, she said, "Don't you ever give up." I received my master's in journalism and magazine writing and publishing. Do you remember magazines, by the way? I was mentored by a former editor at Rolling Stone who told me I had a gift, but the hard part would be my own ability to believe in it. That's the difficult part, he said. Well, as we all know, the real world is much different than college and a dream. My grandma passed away, and I began to listen to all of the doubters externally in my life. I also began to listen to the biggest doubter of all, my own internal fear. I moved from journalism to public relations. We called it the dark side as journalists. And I was miserable in my career. I actually wrote a book about it, so you can ask a question if you want about that. Ironically, my mother became a hospice nurse at the end of her nursing career, and I used to ride around the Ozarks with her. It's the only way I could get to see her. She had this rusted Toyota Corolla, and when I'd see her, she would cross train tracks and creek beds and dry creek beds, go everywhere to visit patients at the end of their lives who had no family left, little money. And she would tell me when she would emerge from their houses, nearly every person I care for at the end of their lives is filled with regret. I beg of you, as my only remaining child, not to live your life with any regret. And so I started writing a book, and it was awful. I was so worried about failing or writing what I thought people wanted or that I thought would make money, like Harry Potter, but with cats, or Twilight, but with really tan people. I was worried about hurting those that I loved, that awful things began to happen from my head to my hand, imagination to laptop. And when I finally showed my book to my husband, Gary, he said, "It sounds nothing like you. Why don't you just tell a story like you always do when you talk to a friend?" I was devastated. It's not what like any writer wants to hear, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. And so I thought of Irma Bombeck again, of all those columns I read and studied, and I thought, just write a deeply personal, universal story about family in my own voice. And I used what I call the 3 H's. Humor plus heartbreak equals honesty. I started getting up at 4 a.m. every single morning before work for years to write. We adopted a dog from a shelter that we were talking about. This was supposed to be 35 pounds. She grew to be 85 pounds. And that dog became my alarm clock. When I would not get up at 4 a.m., she would push me out of bed. I would take her outside to tinkle, bring her back in, thinking in the beginning she wanted to be my partner in writing, and she would take my place in bed. But it got me into the groove of getting up. And I didn't stop until I was pushing commas around on that first book. And then I had no idea what to do. I was a kid from the Ozarks. I had no connections, didn't know how to get an agent from Adam, but I knew I'd always been a good student, so I started studying how you get a literary agent. And on New Year's Eve, with Gary and my mother on each side of me, we walked to the local post office, and I sent out 15 query letters. Those were the days of self-addressed stamped envelopes. I can explain those too. I like to say we paid for our own rejection back in the day. And when I put those into the mailbox, I said, "Here goes nothing." And my mother said, "No, here goes everything." A week later, I got 7 requests to read my full manuscript. 2 weeks later, I got 3 formal offers of representation. 2 weeks later, my first memoir sold at auction to Dutton, which was an imprint of Penguin. By the way, you always dream of moments like that. When my agent called me to tell me she'd sold my book, I don't know why I'm sharing this. Thanks, wine. I was an hour out of hernia surgery. So the good news, hurt a little bit. And I lost my mind after that first book deal. I quit my well-paying, soul-sucking job. I gave up my health insurance, my IRA, my retirement, sold our house, moved to the woods in Michigan, had nothing, no second book contract. We moved in February. And we ended up in a house that we still have, a Knotty Pine Cottage from the early 1900s that was the closest replication that I could find in my grandparents' log cabin. People always ask, how did I get to Michigan? Side note, when we lived in St. Louis, if you know St. Louis, it's not a pleasant place to live in the summer. It's 100 degrees, 100% humidity. You don't go lay out by the Mississippi River. So we went to Cape Cod. And the innkeeper there was actually from Michigan. And she said, why did you come so far for beaches? Why didn't you just drive to Michigan? And I said, Michigan has beaches? Which is what a landlocked Midwesterner says. And we came to vacation in Saugatuck the next year, and I fell in love. I thought it was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen in my life. Came back the next year, vacationed up and down the West Coast, fell further in love, and ended up buying a house. Quit my job and moved. And I realized I had no second book deal, which means I had no money. I had no contract. And I was writing on spec, which means you're writing without getting paid a dime for it, like I'm sure so many of you do. And yet I got up every morning for the first time in my life and felt like I was making $1 million. I was scared out of my wits that I ruined my life, and yet I believed so much in what I was writing and my purpose that I believed my agent could sell that book. And she did. I didn't have a contract for my second book, she sold it. No contract for my third book, she sold it. No contract for my fourth book, and she sold it. I thought I would never be stopped. And then I lost my mother, who watched my third memoir chosen as a Today Show book pick from her hospice bed a few weeks before she passed away. Then my father fell into dementia, and I wrote a book that my agent finally couldn't sell. And I thought my career was over. I went home stressed and depressed, and I'm sure many of you have been in the same spot I've been, to help your parent, the one that drives you out of your mind, move into a smaller home and sell all the junk that had been accumulated for decades. And one day, overwhelmed, I went up into the attic, and there I found boxed up all of my grandmother's heirlooms. I found her charm bracelets and her recipe boxes and her quilts and her family Bibles, her scrapbooks, Hope Chest McCoy vases, desert rose dishes, along with that photo of Irma Bombeck. And I restarted my writing career that day. I started writing my very first Michigan-based novel, The Charm Bracelet, on top of a cardboard box. That book would go on to be sold in less than a year in 15 countries and become a #1 bestseller in Germany, Spain, Italy, and the US. When I told my literary agent what I had planned, that I wanted to use my grandmother's name as a pen name to honor her, I mean, that's really Victor Victoria, isn't it? My agent called me and asked that if I were off my meds. She's probably watching. But when I told her that I wanted people to say my grandmother's name, when I told her that I wanted them to say Viola Shipman, when they walk into this library in 50 years, long after I'm gone, and say a woman's name that had never been said while she was alive with respect, it would be the greatest honor and thank you that I could give to her. And my agent cried. And then she supported my dream with all she had. That was numerous books ago, 17 to be exact. And my new novel, The Page Turner, will publish from HarperCollins in April. And I just signed a new 3-book contract with them. And thank you. And I've also mentioned this, and it is in slow motion happening. My novel, The Secret of Snow, has been optioned to become a TV movie as well. So the end point of all of this is not, well, the applause is nice, but it's that there's no straight line for a dream. There's no timetable for anything that you believe in. I believe that every story deserves to be told. I believe that every voice deserves to be heard. And the only thing holding us back in this life, no matter it is what we want to do, it could be travel, it could be art, it could be writing, it could be changing jobs, it could be leaving a terrible person in your life. The thing that holds us back is fear. It takes a lot of courage to show your dreams to someone else. I have that Irma Bombeck quote on a plaque over my writing desk. The only things you need to succeed in life and writing, you already have inside of you. You have a history, a story, a unique voice, and a heart to guide you. There will be rejection and bad days and knock you to your knees, heartbreak and loss. There will always be that in life. But I beg of all of you to look at that as an opportunity to grow and become stronger and not stop pursuing the person you dream of becoming. I've had to crawl over obstacles. I've had to walk through walls. I've had to beg. I've had to cry. I've had to work harder than I've ever had in my entire life. And when I do, I think of my grandfather. When I asked him how he could rake rocks at the end of his life to make money, my grandpa looked at me and said, sometimes you just keep your head down and do what you got to do. And that's what you got to do in life, even with a dream. All of the books I write are meant as a tribute to women like my mom and grandma, women like so many of you here tonight, that are just good, kind, funny, hardworking women who get knocked down by life and then get back up and forge on with as much humor, dignity, and faith as you can muster. Women that I was not reading about when I was reading fiction. My books are filled with laughter, and I write them to remind readers of what matters most in life. Each other, the simplest of things, the stuff we forget about every day because we're just trying to get through life. Every book I write, and we need to remember this more than ever right now, I write books that remind you that there is more that connects us than divides us. And there is on any given day. And yet we choose to focus on the things that tear us apart. My books are a reminder about what my grandmother called the ripple effect of kindness in this life. My grandmother always said, good begets good and bad begets bad. She was a woman overlooked by society at the time because she offered nothing of value. But look at the legacy of my grandmother's life and the power she had on me in this world simply by loving unconditionally. What is unconditional love? It is to love without conditions. How are most of us loved in our lives? How do most of us give love? With specific conditions. But when conditions are removed, it changes your life because you will eventually, slowly learn to love yourself in that same way too. And I'm telling you, that will open the door when you need it most. When you face loss or rejection, the end of a book deal, the loss of a father, a mother, a grandmother, or friendship, you will have the ability to stand up and take a step and then take one more step again. Because that foundation was laid for you by the people that came before you. I used to believe there was a golden key that was passed around New York City. I believe it was given only to a select few writers and I believed that I would never receive that key. You all already know no such key exists, but the one inside of you does, and will open up the world if you just lock away your fear and open your heart to a dream. All the power resides within. All you have to do, as Irma Bombeck wrote me nearly 50 years ago, is to keep writing, laughing, and believing. I want to thank you all for having me tonight. I know my mom and grandmother are smiling down from heaven right now, having poured 2 cups of coffee and sliced 2 pieces of cherry chip cake. They placed my speech on the refrigerator under a cow magnet. And my mom is telling my grandmother and a host of angels the never-ending story. And my father's just trying to drink a beer and watch the World Series from a nearby crowd. And he's yelling, "Land the plane, Geraldine." So thank you all, and I'll take questions that we might have. Yes, there's a woman in the back that has a question. I am. Yeah. So we're all going to go hang after this, and we don't need questions from like old people like you.
I'd like to remind everyone, if you still have a question in your hand that you would like to ask, please pass it over to the right. All right. Well, I think we're all a little bit teary-eyed after that amazing and inspiring talk. Thank you so much, Wade. So the audience have some questions for you. I'm going to read a couple of them too. Starting out with a little bit of a heavy one here. Did your father ever end up believing in you and your writing?
Great question. So, yes. The last memoir I wrote was a memoir called Magic Season. It came out the year before last, and it was a Michigan Notable Book of the Year. And it's about my relationship with my father. I talk a lot about my mother and my grandmother, but not a lot about my father. And my father and I had, if you can believe it, I love sports. I'm a huge sports fan. And we loved baseball, especially in the St. Louis Cardinals. And this book takes place over the very last baseball game we ever watched together, inning by inning, and kind of goes back and forth through our lives. Long story short, yes, my father, for 2 to 3 years, did not talk to me. And eventually did one of the biggest 180s you could ever imagine in life, and came to love me and Gary as much as he did anyone else in his family. My father also began to appreciate the sacrifices that I made. You know, my father and I never saw eye to eye on much, but my father blessed me with so many things. A love of family, a great deal of faith, a respect for where you're raised and your environment. My father was funny. My father was good with money. My father was an entrepreneur. So those things actually began to forge a closeness after many years, and he did. This book is about, I talk about unconditional love. My mother and grandmother mirrored that to me, and I mirrored that to my father, and I think that saved him at the end of his life.
Wow, that's incredible. Next question is, what is your favorite book that you've written, and why? If you have one, if you have a favorite.
That's a hard, I know yes. I always say that. It's always like asking a mother or grandmother, who's your favorite child or grandchild? And the truth is you got one, but you can't say it. I have different I have different answers. I have to say one of my personal favorites that I've written is The Heirloom Garden. Um, it came at a very difficult time in my life. It was published in April of 2020. Do you remember what happened?
Oh boy.
And the book just kind of went nowhere. But it's a beautiful book about, inspired by my grandmother and her gardens, about two women that find hope through her heirloom garden and the flowers that she grows. And the book has kind of become a perennial. It's one of my best-selling books now. People continue to find it. Book clubs love it. And I think it's a beautiful book, and I'm very proud of it. Magic Season is one of my favorites. It was a very difficult memoir to write. I wrote a memoir called At Least in the City. Someone would hear me scream. It's very different from my memoirs. It's very David Sedaris. It was picked as a Today Show summer read, but it's about me and Gary moving to the woods of Michigan in February, thinking it would be a resort town, and it's me and men in camo hunting. And it's all, one of my favorite books growing up was Walden, and centered around it turns Walden on its head. And I have to say, my new book that's coming out, The Page Turner, it's very Viola, but very different. It's all about how books and reading save us, but a real hard look at the publishing industry today. How difficult it is to get published. I can tell all of you the 12 books that you will be reading next year, which is not fair, but they're the books that are going to get the notoriety and the money and the attention, and just how difficult it is for authors to make a go of it as the world gets harder and harder. So I'm very proud of it. And it's got a real kind of wise, younger lead character that's very funny. So it brings a lot more of my humor into it.
So let's talk about that publishing end of it for just a moment here. If there were any aspiring writers in the audience today, what advice would you give them to somebody that's looking to start their own book or complete a book that maybe they've already started?
Oh, how long do you got? So number one, write. I know that sounds stupid, but write. Here's what happens. We all have a dream. I wanted to write, but I didn't write because you put everything up, and sometimes you have to. You put everything else in your life ahead of your dream. You've got a job. You got a family. You got to get food on the table for dinner. You got to get your kids to soccer practice. You have a real job that pays real money. You got to mow the lawn. And so you make all of that kind of secondary to your dream, and you never get around to it. And so you have to put that aside. Second is listen to your heart. What is that? We all have this. We're all born with a unique voice and a gift. And this world tries its damnedest to knock that uniqueness out of us. It is easier and better if we're all the same. It's easier on us if we fit in. It's easier if we're not weird, if we're not funny, if we're not pursuing a career that's not normal. It's easier. And yet it's the worst choice you can make because it robs you of everything you are. And you're going to wake up at the age of 40, like I did, and be a miserable human being because you never truly believed or loved in the gifts that you were given. It doesn't have to be writing. It can be whatever you want. Most of the letters I get are, they could be from women that said, I became an attorney because my entire family were lawyers. I always wanted to be an architect, whatever it is. There's a displeased to please in this world where we work so hard to make everybody else happy but ourselves. And it does a huge disservice to us. And then we give in to fear. We're scared to pursue what we want because we think we're going to fail or we're not going to make money or something bad will happen. And I guarantee you something bad will happen. there's a greater chance that something great will happen. And write the story that calls to you. If you're writing a 400-page book, don't write something you think is going to sell, because it's not. And you're not going to finish it, and it's going to suck. Write something that calls to you. I don't care what it is, and believe in that.
Wow. That was, yep. I know I needed to hear that. And I think so many people needed to hear that as well. It's amazing. What did your family and friends have to say about when they found out that you were writing what some would consider women's fiction?
It's a good question. I would say my family and my circle was very supportive. In the beginning, it was a difficult sell in publishing because there was a sensitivity, which I completely understand. And this is, the page turner addresses a lot of this. If you look at the history of pen names in literature, the majority were by women that had to choose male pen names in order to get their work taken seriously. So there was a sensitivity among some that what I was doing with the genre that I was writing was taking away from women. So I had to navigate that very, very sensitively. I've always said from the beginning, from day one, when I sent, before anyone had read a word of what I'd written, I sent this to my agent, as I said to you tonight. I chose a pen name to honor a woman who not only inspired the books that I write, but who never got her due in society. That meant a lot to me, and it still does. And that's why I chose a pen name. And slowly, and now very rapidly, that backstory has really resonated. And we were talking at dinner tonight, so many authors that write women's fiction have been my greatest supporters now. They love the story and the reason that I write it. And I will also say my new book looks at that too. Why when authors write fiction about themes that are about or for women, are they called women's fiction or chick lit? Or, if I were a man writing literary fiction, it'd be literary fiction. So there's a disservice to that on kind of the genre shaming that goes on too. It's wrong.
It absolutely is. Absolutely. Are you ever thinking about using the Upper Peninsula as a book setting, or possibly Mackinac City or Mackinac Island?
Yes. You started to ask that and you go, are you ever thinking? I'm like, no, not really. Yes, that's happening. So I did pitch the novel I'm working on now. One of the two finalists was a Mackinac book. Let me say, we're holding on that until there's a timing that will be right without giving too much away. So that's in the works at some point.
So we have that to look forward to.
The page turner is set in South Haven.
Okay. So this next question is a question and a comment. The comment part of it says that they wanted to share that they also played and sorted with their grandmother's buttons that filled her skinny wooden drawer from her pedal singer sewing machine. And the question is, what influenced, or what do you think influenced your grandmother to be so open-minded in her day?
That's a great question. I think there's many things. My grandmother, and I don't talk a lot about this a lot either, was Native American and married my grandfather. So in our small community, there were thoughts about that. And I think she was judged and discriminated against for a large part of her life, and saw that same thing happening to me as well, which I think changed her profoundly. My grandmother and mother were not, and so many people that have known my grandmother or known my mother, I still get letters from random Ozarkians about them. They were not typical folk. My grandmother, or my mother, side story, after my brother passed away, the church that we went to began to use his death as kind of a fundraising mechanism, which got very icky, but it also got very emotionally disturbing for my mother. And my mother was so upset that she stepped away from her. You don't step away from little town churches without a lot of talk. And she stepped away from it and started studying, at the time, world religion in the late 70s and early 80s to get a better understanding of her faith and her sense in this world. And my mom started having her own services. We had this giant Arkansas stone patio off the back of our house, and she started having services for what we say in our little town were the ne'er-do-wells, and became kind of like her own church. They were women of their era, but they were not typical. Nor were my great aunts. I mean, they were I was raised by very strong women that just refused to give up on me. And I don't want to overstate this, but first time I took Gary back to where I grew up, we got in the car as we were leaving, and he started crying. He goes, "How did you make it out of here?" And I mean, many didn't, because again, this was not the norm. And yet I will say now, so many of the people, schoolmates, I'm closer with than I've ever been, because they understand, and they love the books, and it's what I keep saying to people. You have to learn to love yourself, and you have to believe in yourself. And when you do, your impact, the impact of each and every one of you, you will never know what it will have on all those around you. You don't know, but you will. But it takes a lot to get to that stage.
What incredible women that
They
raised
were.
you. Absolutely. The next question is a writing related question, and it has to do with, so they ask, the books that feature flashbacks and flash forwards, like Heirloom Garden, for example, do you write all of the scenes from one time period and then intertwine them, or do you write them all together?
Oh, good question.
Very good question.
Yeah, I am, authors are always asked if they're plotters or pantsers. I am full on pants. I always start a book with a question. It's like a question that I'm seeking to answer that I think you all want answered too. And then I develop characters, and then I just start writing. I'm backwards from many writers that I know who have to be very almost mechanical in their processing, which I understand. So many writers that I love and admire, I bet some of your favorite authors, plot. They will write 100 pages before they write a single word. Plot it out on how each, just like a screenplay, how each scene will lay out before them. I get it. I cannot be like that. To me, I wake up with the joy and excitement of not knowing exactly where I'm going. I don't like feeling handcuffed. I do always know when I end a day where I'm going the next day. And I probably am plotting the whole thing in my head. It's just not down, but I do, and it's a crazy experience. Gary will buy a rug. We have this joke. What does Gary purchase for the house that I won't notice for 8 months? And I'm not exaggerating. He bought a new rug, and I walked over it for 8 months. And I turned in my manuscript, and the day I turned in my manuscript, I walked down and I go, Mike, I love this rug. When did we get it? And he's like, a year ago, girl. So even with the back scene, I write it all as I'm going. I sometimes will, I'm not the most literary of writers when I'm in the middle of a manuscript, I will put bold red in the middle that say, dialogue sucks, or add backstory or something to kind of prompt me when I come back, but I kind of don't stop as I'm going. It just works. It works for me.
Well, it seems to be working very well. So this next one is a comment and a question also. And first, they want to say that you nailed it with the Wishing Bridge in terms of Frankenmuth.
Thank you.
So they wanted to know, do you spend a lot of time in Frankenmuth? And also, is Christmas your favorite holiday?
So yes, so I did in Frankenmuth. So any setting, any Michigan setting, as a former journalist, we go to the place and investigate it. So we'll spend time, as I talk about a lot, I will walk the streets and say, what do you love about Farmington? What do you love about Frankenmuth? What do you hate about it? What's it like in the summer? What's it like in the winter? Where do you go for the best piece of pie? What brought you here? What's your grandmother's favorite memory of this place? Anything that I can get that helps me inform the book. And then I visit those places and try and get as much research as I can. And then put that aside, because then I want whatever story it is to match the setting. I never force fit the two together. Christmas, yeah. We're holiday people, so we're real Midwesty. So you're gonna see a hay bale. You're gonna see a scarecrow and about 17 pumpkins. Christmas, we put up, how many trees? 10? 8? 10? We put up 10 themed Christmas trees. One that has 12-foot that has all of our family's heirloom ornaments. There'll be one that has travel ornaments, one that has Snoopy ornaments, one that has cabin ornaments. So yes, and it takes about a month to put up the tree because we get out, we tell stories with every ornament, we pull them out and go, oh my gosh, my grandma got this. And so.
Well, now I want to interject a question, which is your favorite themed tree? Is it the heirloom tree?
I like the heirloom tree because we tell stories about where the ornaments came from, how we got them, how they came into the family. I mean, we even, they're all very special.
It's beautiful. So we have time for one last question. And it's going to be, what kind of books do you like to read?
We were talking about this. So when I'm writing a book, I don't read. So I kind of can't have other stories and characters. We shared a little bit of this. I try to be a voracious reader of all genres when I'm done. So I like biography. I like memoir because I write that. I love David Sedaris. I love Augustin Burroughs, Nora Ephron. I love historical fiction. We were talking Eric Larson. If you've not read, Eric Larson is one of my favorite authors. He's incredible. I will read romance. I like women's fiction. I love Mary Kay Andrews. I love Dottie Frank. I used to read her all the time. Nancy Thayer is a dear friend and read her. So stories that kind of are escapist, I love to read as well. Anne Lamott is one of my favorite writers. If you've not read her, she's an amazing writer.
Wonderful. Wade, thank you so very much. Let's give a nice big round of applause.
Yeah.